I'm Alan Johnson, KU2Y, and this is a video for the CubeSat simulator. This is step 6, building the solar board. And note that these instructions are for the beta 1.3 PCBs, which are these blue boards. If your boards are white, then that indicates you have the version 1.2 PCBs, and there's a different set of instructions and videos for those. So you're going to need a number of tools for this. We're mainly going to be soldering, so of course you're going to need your soldering iron. You'll need solder. I like to use metal curls for cleaning the tip. You can also use a sponge. Needle nose pliers for holding things, side cutters for cutting the excess off the leads. And I also like to use blue putty to hold parts while they're being soldered. You may also need some glue for when we're mounting the JST connectors, just to bond them to the PCB. I like to use super glue gel, but you can use other adhesives as well. So I'm going to follow along here. I have the bill of materials set to the by step tab, and that gives me a list of all the parts that I'm going to need here. I checked them as I was inventorying the parts, and now I'm going to uncheck them as I solder them in. Now, this board actually allows you to use either the blue INA 219 boards or the smaller purple INA 219 boards. The previous versions just used these purple ones, but they got expensive. They also got really unreliable as well. Most of mine that I was buying were failures. So I recommend using the blue ones. If you have purple ones, you can use them, but test them first. Otherwise, I would recommend buying the blue ones here. And some are going to mount on the top of the board, some are going to mount on the bottom. Okay, let's get started. So we're going to start with the resistors R3 and R4, which are 4.7K ohm resistors. Here they are. They have the color bands yellow, violet, red is 4.7K. And we're going to mount all the resistors and diodes on the board vertically. So I'm going to bend it over like this. That way we can save space on the board for mounting it. Okay. So I'm going to install them here, and I'm going to, this is the top of the board. You can tell because it's got the AMSAT logo and the version number printed on it. That's the top. So I'm going to install R3 and R4. Like that. And then I'm going to slightly bend the leads just to give it a little bit of mechanical strength and also so they don't fall out. And now I'm going to solder one lead at a time on each component. That way I can check it and adjust it and move it around. Once you've soldered 2 or more pins, it becomes much harder to remove or modify a part. So just going to solder 1 pin on this resistor and 1 pin on that resistor. And now I flip it over and take a look. Make sure that they're straight. Resistors don't have a polarity, but when we're doing diodes, it'll be very important to check. Okay, looks good. So now I'm going to continue and solder the other pin. Okay. Looks good. Now I'm going to use the side cutters. You definitely want to have your safety glasses on for this because the ends can go flying. Also, I like to just put my thumb on it to hold it, then it won't fly. Okay, so that looks good. So that is R3 and R4, the two 4.7K resistors. Now we're going to install the diodes. So here are the 6 diodes that we're going to install, D1 through D6. And if you look at the diodes, they have a polarity on them. And it's important to get the polarity right, otherwise they won't work correctly. You see on the right-hand side here, as I hold it, there is a band, a stripe, which is in silver. And so for instance, if I'm installing this one as D1, if you look at the symbol for D1, it's got the diode symbol with the arrow, which is pointing to the right, and then a vertical line, which represents the band. So D1 is going to go in this direction here. Hopefully you can see that. If not, the wiki has some close-up photographs that you can see. So that's going to be the polarity for D1. And then, for example, D4 next to it there is going to have the opposite polarity like this. Okay, so we're going to mount all the diodes vertically. So I'm going to bend them all over. And I usually do it so the band is sticking up. That way you can clearly see the band. Okay, so those are them. And so this is how we're going to do them. The D1, D2, and D3 are going to be like this. And D4, D5, and D6 are going to be like that. And just like the resistors, we're going to install them on the top. So I'm going to plug them in here. And just have a close-up look at that. You can see the band is at the top here, and that's connected to the lead on the right. So that is the correct polarity there. D1, D2, D3, D4, D5, and D6. And before I solder them here, I'm going to do one more check of the polarity. Make sure I don't have one of them in there backwards. Looks good. So I can flip it over here. I'm going to spread the leads slightly, although they stay in pretty well. Okay. So now I'm going to solder them in. And just because I always do, I'm going to solder one pin on each device. And then do a final check to make sure that they're fully installed and that the polarity is correct. Because if it's wrong, it's relatively easy to to uninstall one pin and fix it, whereas once you have two pins, it is much more difficult. Okay, so final polarity check here. Looks good. Okay, just inspect them, make sure nothing is bridged, make sure everything is on there. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, so now I'm going to trim the leads. Okay. Let's have a look. Yep, everything looks good. Okay, so now we're going to do the connector J1. Now this is our first component that's going to be installed on the bottom of the PCB. So I'm going to flip it over here. And you notice here the rectangle outline of it and the label J1. So that is the clue that it is installed here on the bottom. And then hold it in place, flip it over, and then I'm going to solder it on the top. And I'm going to start by just soldering one pin on each side. And notice with these pads, they're not round, they're kind of elongated, and that's to make it easier to apply heat to the pad and the pin. So I'm gonna, oops, back in here. So I'm going to be soldering it on this angle. That way I can make good contact here. So I heat up the pad and the pin, and I apply just the right amount of solder to fill it like that. Too much solder, and it can bridge, but that looks good. Now I flip it over, double check, make sure it's installed all the way, make sure there's no gap, make sure it's not leaning on an angle. That looks good. That looks like right angles. And also just, again, this is last check to double check that I installed it on the bottom and that I'm soldering it on the top. Okay, so I'm going to solder one pin on the other side. And again, make a final check to make sure there's no gaps, make sure it's straight. Looks good. Okay, so now I'm going to just go down the line and solder all the pins. Oops, see that one bridged. You see that? So because there's only a small amount of solder, I can just unbridge it if I just heat both pins at the same time here and then remove my iron. Here we go. Oops, that one bridged too. Look at that. Again, I'm just gonna put the iron in between and then move it. Add a little solder to that one. Okay, so that's one row done. Looks good. Now we'll do the other side. Okay. Looks good. Okay, so now we're going to start installing some of the INA 219 current and voltage sensor boards. And we're going to start by installing two of them on the bottom. So I'm going to flip the board upside down. And then I'm going to install one here on the left, on the right, and one here on the other side. Like that. If you notice these pin headers, they have a long side and a short side. Doesn't really matter which way you do it. I usually like to insert the long side into the board. So that's how I do it. So I will insert both of those, and notice it's the middle ones here. It's not these two on the outer side. Those are for the other side. And I'm going to use two little pieces of blue putty just to hold them in place so that when I flip it over, they don't just fall out. And that should also hold them vertical too. Okay. So now I'm going to solder one pin on each. Flip it over, and now I can take the blue putty off, and I can make sure that they're fully inserted, that there's no gaps. This one's a tiny bit crooked, but not really enough to worry about. This one's straighter. Yep, looks good. So I can then finish soldering the other pins. And I just want to use the minimum amount of solder so that the pins don't bridge. Okay. Looks good. So now I'm ready to install the boards, and I'm just going to put some blue putty here so that when I put the board in, this, Go. And I'm going to push them down so that they are level. It just looks better. Okay. And the blue putty will also hold them in place. Okay. And I do the soldering here on top. And do one pin on each. And check it here. Everything looks good. And then I'll continue soldering the other pins. Again, I just need to make sure not to touch the iron on this connector since the plastic will melt. Okay, let's have a look. Actually, I'm not happy with this one here. I don't know if you can see it, but I can see the outline of the pad indicating the solder is not adhered to it. Also, some of these are sort of ball shaped rather than Hershey Kiss shaped. So just going to heat him up again. Apply some solder. See if I can get it to flow. That's better. Okay, let's have a look now. That's better. Okay, so so now I can remove the putty. Sometimes if the putty's underneath, you might need to scrape it a little more. Yeah, that putty got stuck in there. Maybe because it's sloping slightly the wrong way. There we go. Niche. Okay. So that is the two of them on the bottom. Now, these INA 219 boards, they have jumpers. They're labeled A0 and A1. You see there's two of them here, and there's two of them over there. And there's, so we actually want to put a bridge on jumper A0 of this one here on the right. So I'm just going to apply a bit of heat, put the iron across both pads. There we go. So you can see there's a bridge there. Across A0, we leave A1 alone, and this one we don't do anything to either. So that takes care of the addressing. Okay, so now we flip it over to the top, and we're going to do the last 4 INA 219 boards, which will be here on the top. And note there's often there's this extra screw terminal with these boards that we don't use. So you can just get rid of it or use it for some other project. Okay. So let's place these boards, how they're going to go. And then we need the pin headers for each of them. Okay. And we're going to need 4 pieces of blue putty. So, and again, I like to insert the longer end to the board, but either way works. And these 4 pin headers are all on the outside of the board. Yeah. And just do a little blue putty. Okay, and I'm just gonna check to make sure they're all straight and fully inserted. Okay, looks good. And I'm going to solder 1 pin per. Okay. Take the putty off. Make sure they're all installed all the way. See, this one's popped out a tiny bit. I could fix that one, I guess. If I just apply a little bit of pressure to it and heat it up, there we go. Now he is fully inserted. Okay, so now we're ready to mount the boards. I'm going to do the blue putty differently this time so that I don't have the trouble I had last time. I'm just going to use a little daub of it on the far end. That way it should be easier to remove. Oh, except I have to solder the other pins. Can't forget that. Do the other side. There we go. Okay. All right, so now I'm ready to put these on. Okay. So now I'm just gonna push down into the putty here so that they're level. And like this one, see how this one's popped up a little bit, so pushing him down. Okay, looks good. So again, I'm gonna solder one pin. On each. Double check. Yep, looks good. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, so see a couple I don't like here. The second one, this ground pin, see how you can see the outline of the pad? That's definitely not good. VCC, the one next to it, that's sort of round, indicating I have too much solder. Also, this VCC is also round, indicating that that I blobbed too much on there. So just going to redo those and apply more heat and more solder here to the ground. All right, let's have a look. That's better. Okay, so now we can remove the putty, which fortunately comes out easier. This one is still fighting me. Maybe I use the extra sticky putty. Okay. So it looks good. Now, some people like to trim the excess leads here. I don't think there's any need to, but you can do it if you like. Okay. So now we need to set some jumpers. So let's start on the right side here. So the right top one, we want to bridge both A1 and A0, and the right bottom here, we want to bridge just A1. So I'm going to turn it sideways here, so it's the right angle for my iron. And for this top one, I'm going to do both of them. And for the bottom one, I'm just going to do A1. Let's double check. Yep, looks good. And then on the other side, we just need to bridge A0 in the bottom left there. Doesn't want to bridge, does he? There we go. If you have trouble doing that, you can also use like an offcut, a tiny piece of offcut from a resistor or a diode. You can lay it on there, but usually you can do it with the solder there. Okay, so no bridges, A0, A1, and A0 and A1. And by the way, it actually says that on the PCB itself, in case you forget which one. Okay, so now we're ready to install the JST2 connectors that will go to the solar panels and also to the other boards as well. So again, sometimes it's a good idea to add a little drop of glue. It depends on the JST connectors. Some of them, when you put them in, they actually lock in place. Let's see what these ones do. Yeah, these ones do not. See how that goes in and it's just loose. So I'm going to apply a little bit of glue to help hold that in place. Okay, so I'm just going to apply a tiny bit of glue to each one as I put it on there. And you'll notice that these JST connectors, they have a slot on one side. The slot always faces the outside. So and again, just be careful not to get the glue on the pins. Otherwise, it will make it difficult to solder. And again, if your JST2 connectors. If they snap in, then you don't need to bother with adhesive, since they will stay pretty well. Okay, almost done. Okay, so we have all 14 of them. Installed. Now, even though there's some glue on them, they can still potentially fall off. So I'm just going to use a little bit of blue putty here so that they don't fall off, and just make sure when you do it that they're in all the way. Okay. Okay, so ready to solder, and I'm just going to do one pin on each one. That way they can be easily straightened. Okay. Now we can remove putty. And look at them. It's a last chance to verify that they're all in the right way, that the slot is facing out. Good. This one's a little crooked. So I'm just going to heat it up while I apply some downward pressure. Go. Very good. Okay, so now I can continue and solder the other pin. Okay, and just check these carefully to make sure that none of them are bridged and that they're all good solder joints. Looks good. Now, even though we've used glue here, it's still a good idea when if you're pulling a cable out that you just use a fingernail or a fine screwdriver just to hold the connector while you pull the wire out. That'll just take the stress off of the solder joint and or the glue. Okay. So now we just need to do the quick connector, which is this red board here. And this will allow us to easily connect additional sensors to the Raspberry Pi Zero if we want to in the future. You can also wire additional sensors down here. This is also the I2C bus there. Okay, so we have the quick connector and the pin header. So I'm going to insert the pin header. I'm going to put some blue putty on it here. Hold it in place. Okay, looks good. Okay, so now we're going to install the quick connector. Make sure you have it the right way here. This way here would be the wrong way. You see the outline doesn't line up. So we want to do it like that. And actually that's staying pretty well even without any putty. So as we do this, just be careful not to touch those black plastic connectors with the iron, otherwise they will melt. Okay, looks good. Okay. All right, and now the board is finished soldering, and we can, these ones here are where the solar panels are going to connect. There's 2 solar panels on each, and it's labeled. For example, this one is labeled -X solar panel. It's also on the side that it's facing. And these 2 here are for connecting to the other boards. The top one is labeled stem, and the bottom one is labeled battery. So if you built the battery board already, you would have plugged in a JST jumper, and the other end of that JST jumper will, once we stack the boards, will plug in here where it says battery. But for now, I'm going to plug this JST jumper here on JP7, where it says stem. So that'll be ready to plug into the stem board. Okay, so that completes step 6 to build the CubeSatSim solar board.